You spent your whole life thinking something was wrong with you, not because someone sat you down and said it directly, but because life has strange ways of teaching silence. The looks, the misunderstandings, the moments when your feelings were called dramatic, your thoughts called complicated, your sensitivity treated like weakness. And slowly, without realizing it, you began building a quiet case against yourself. You learned to shrink, to explain less, feel less, reveal less. You became skilled at hiding the parts of yourself that made other people uncomfortable. Not because those parts were broken, but because rejection has a way of training the nervous system to survive through disguise. So you adapted. You smiled when you felt disconnected. You stayed available when you felt drained. You tolerated conversations that starved your soul. You carried emotional weight that was never yours to hold. And over time, the performance became exhausting, because there is a pain for. Everyone talks about the pain of being surrounded, yet emotionally unseen. You began asking questions in silence. Why do I feel everything so deeply? Why do crowds exhaust me? Why do shallow connections feel empty? Why do I notice emotional tension before anyone says a word? And perhaps the heaviest question of all, why have I always felt different? But what if the truth is far more uncomfortable? What if your struggle was never caused by weakness? What if the real pain came from spending years forcing yourself into spaces that demanded self-abandonment? Because ordinary environments often reward emotional numbness. Move faster, feel less, question nothing, adapt at any cost. But your mind resisted, your spirit resisted. Something inside you refused to become emotionally unconscious just to belong. And that refusal created friction, not because you were difficult, but because depth rarely feels comfortable inside shallow systems. What if you were never too much, just too aware of hidden motives, too aware of emotional dishonesty, too aware of energy that words try to hide? And awareness is heavy. It makes you notice cracks others overlook. It makes your heart hesitate where others rush in blindly. It makes belonging complicated. This is the truth many never dare to confront. Sometimes the loneliness you carry does not come from being unworthy. It comes from living in a world that misunderstands emotional depth. And maybe, just maybe, the parts of yourself you spent years trying to fix were never flaws at all. Maybe they were signs. Signs that your inner world was never designed to live asleep. And once you begin seeing yourself through that lens, everything changes. Some people enter a room and disappear into it. You never could. Not because you demanded attention, not because you wanted eyes on you, but because your presence carried something difficult to ignore. And that has confused you for years. You watched others move through life effortlessly, blending into conversations, adapting to social expectations, saying what needed to be said, laughing at what everyone else laughed at, while you felt different, not superior, not special, just strangely visible, even when you stayed quiet, especially when you stayed quiet, because energy speaks long before words do. And yours was never designed for performance. You notice how people shift around you. Some open up too quickly, as if your silence feels safer than noise. Others become uncomfortable without understanding why, as if your presence quietly reflects parts of themselves they usually avoid. You have seen this happen. The room changes, the atmosphere changes, and suddenly you become aware of something you never asked for. Your existence affects people. That can feel heavy, because carrying noticeable energy is not always a gift. Sometimes it feels like pressure. You learned this early. Maybe you were told you were intense, too serious, too emotional, too observant, too hard to read. So you questioned yourself. You tried becoming easier, smaller. You softened your opinions, filtered your emotions, pretended not to notice what you clearly felt. You attempted to disappear into the room like everyone else, but something inside you resisted. Because pretending is exhausting when your nervous system craves truth. And here is the uncomfortable reality. People are often unsettled by what feels authentic. Not because authenticity is dangerous, but because it exposes masks. Many interactions survive through performance. Politeness without sincerity. Connection without depth. Words without presence. But your energy struggles to participate in emotional theater. You feel when something is forced. You sense distance behind affection. Tension beneath smiles. Exhaustion hidden beneath confidence. And this awareness makes blending difficult. Not impossible, but costly. Because every time you betray your inner knowing just to fit in, your spirit pays the price. So maybe your inability to disappear was never social failure. Maybe it was something else. Maybe your energy was never meant to become invisible, not to dominate. not to control. There is a personality type that feels deeply, sees quietly, and survives differently. It often walks alone, not out of arrogance, but because shallow connection feels like emotional starvation. And if this is you, you know exactly what that silence feels like. People misunderstand it. They assume distance means pride. They assume solitude means coldness. They mistake your caution for disinterest. But they do not see what is happening beneath the surface. Because your inner world does not process life casually. You do not enter relationships carelessly. You do not attach without feeling. And you cannot pretend connection where your soul feels none. That has made life complicated. You have sat in crowded rooms and felt alone. Not because nobody was present, but because presence and connection are not the same thing. You learned this painfully. Some conversations drained you instead of nourishing you. Some relationships demanded performance instead of truth. Some bonds looked close from the outside, yet left your spirit starving on the inside. And slowly, your nervous system became protective. Not closed, protective, because there is a difference. A closed heart rejects everyone. A protective heart simply refuses to abandon itself again. So you became selective, not because you hate people, but because your energy pays attention to what others overlook. You notice emotional inconsistency. You notice forced intimacy. You notice when words and energy refuse to match. And once you notice these things, it becomes difficult to ignore them. This is why shallow connection feels unbearable to you. Because shallow connection asks you to participate without being fully seen. Smile. Play along. Keep things light. Ignore what you feel. But your inner world resists that bargain. Your soul does not crave quantity. It craves truth. And truth is rare. So there were seasons when you chose solitude. Not because loneliness felt good. It didn't. Loneliness carries its own ache. But false belonging hurts differently. It asks you to betray yourself for temporary comfort. And somewhere along your journey, you grew tired of paying that price. So you walked alone. You protected your peace. You stepped back from emotional noise. You stopped forcing access to people who only understood fragments of you. That choice was not weakness. It was survival. Because some personalities survive differently. They heal differently, love differently, trust differently. And perhaps this is the truth you have been afraid to admit. You were never avoiding people. You were avoiding the emptiness that comes from being emotionally surrounded, yet spiritually unfed. And once your soul learns the difference between company and connection, it becomes impossible to settle for emotional crumbs again. Your mind notices what others ignore. Your nervous system absorbs what others dismiss. And your soul remembers pain long after everyone else has moved on. That is not weakness. That is a different design. And living with that design can feel exhausting, because you do not move through life untouched. You notice small changes, the shift in someone's voice, the silence hiding behind their words, the tension in a room before conflict even begins. While others brush past these details, your mind records them, not by choice, by instinct. You have probably questioned this about yourself. Why do I notice so much? Why do I carry emotions that are not even mine? Why does my body react before my logic understands what feels wrong? And perhaps you judged yourself for it, called yourself too sensitive, too emotional, too affected by things that others seem to forget overnight. But your experience, NCE of life, works differently. Your nervous system does not treat everything as background noise. It scans, observes, protects, because somewhere in your journey, awareness became survival. Maybe disappointment taught you caution. Maybe betrayal sharpened your perception. Maybe emotional instability trained your body to read invisible signals. And now your system notices patterns before your conscious mind can explain them. That can be both a gift and a burden. Because awareness does not switch off when convenient. You feel atmospheres. You absorb emotional environments. You carry conversations long after they end. And sometimes you become tired without understanding why. Not physically, emotionally, as if your soul has been carrying invisible weight. People rarely understand this. They say things like, "You think too much. You need to let it go. You're too affected." But healing is not a race, and memory is not weakness, especially emotional memory. Because your soul remembers what your mouth tried to forgive. It remembers how certain words made you shrink, how certain betrayals changed the way you trust, how certain losses rearranged the architecture of your inner world. And no, that does not mean you are fragile. It means your experiences leave fingerprints. Just like scars remain on skin, emotional pain leaves marks on the nervous system. This is why you sometimes revisit old wounds, not because you enjoy suffering, but because unresolved pain echoes. Your inner world searches for understanding, for closure, for peace. And perhaps this is the truth you have struggled to accept. Your sensitivity was never proof of weakness. It was proof that your system refuses numbness. You were not designed to move through life emotionally asleep. You were designed to feel deeply, to notice carefully, to remember honestly. And while that design may make life heavier at times, it also makes your awareness rare. Because in a world trained to disconnect from feeling, your soul still listens. You learn to hide parts of yourself just to feel accepted, to stay quieter, smaller, easier to understand. But that did not happen overnight. No one hands you a manual for self-erasure. It happens slowly, through moments that seem harmless at first. A feeling dismissed, a truth laughed at, a wound ignored, a version of you that felt too honest for the room. And without realizing it, you began editing yourself. You measured your words before speaking, softened your emotions before expressing them, reduced your intensity to protect other people's comfort, because acceptance can become addictive when you fear rejection. So you adapted. You learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which parts created discomfort. Your sensitivity? Too much. Your depth? Too serious. Your honesty? Too intense. And somewhere along the way, you absorbed a dangerous lesson. Be less of yourself to be loved. So you beka. Me quieter, not peaceful. Quieter. There is a difference. Peace comes from alignment. Silence born from fear comes from survival. And survival has its own language. Smile when something hurts. Nod when something feels wrong. Stay agreeable. Stay manageable. Do not create tension. Do not reveal too much. Do not let your inner world become inconvenient. And for a while, this strategy worked. You avoided conflict. You gained approval. You learned how to move through spaces without unsettling anyone. But there was a hidden cost. Because every time you abandon your truth to preserve connection, something inside you weakened. Not your worth, your connection to yourself. And that loss is difficult to explain. It feels like living behind glass. You function. You participate, you smile. Yet something feels distant, as if the real you is standing quietly behind the performance, waiting to be acknowledged. This is the ache many carry in silence, not because they are unloved, but because they are loved only through edited versions of themselves. And edited love never feels safe, because deep inside, your soul knows the truth. If they only accept the mask, they do not truly know you. So exhaustion begins to grow. Your nervous system grows tired of pretending. Your heart grows tired of translating itself. Your spirit grows tired of surviving through self-reduction. And eventually, something changes. Because some truths refuse to stay buried forever. The parts of you tried to silence begin returning. Your voice becomes harder to suppress. Your boundaries become harder to ignore. Your inner knowing becomes louder than your fear of disapproval. Not out of rebellion, out of necessity. Because there comes a moment when your soul asks a painful question. How much of yourself have you sacrificed just to remain acceptable? And once that question enters your life, the old version of survival begins to crack, because you were never meant to die. Spear inside your own story. You were meant to return to yourself. The rarest personalities are not always the loudest. They are often the most misunderstood. The ones called distant, too sensitive, or difficult, when in reality they simply refuse to betray their inner world. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Because this world often misunderstands quiet strength. It celebrates noise, speed, constant visibility. Speak louder, move faster, be more available. Explain yourself less. But not every soul was designed for performance. Some personalities move differently. They observe before they trust, feel before they speak, and question before they surrender their energy. To the outside world, this can look confusing. People see your caution and call it distance. They see your emotional depth and call it sensitivity. They see your boundaries and call you difficult. But labels are often created by people who do not understand what they are seeing. Because what they call difficult may simply be self-respect. And what they call distant may simply be discernment. You have likely lived this experience. Being misunderstood without doing anything wrong. Feeling judged for protecting your peace. Feeling pressured to become more convenient, more agreeable, more emotionally available than your spirit felt safe being. And over time, these misunderstandings leave scars. You start wondering, am I too guarded? Too complicated? Too hard to love? But those questions carry hidden pain. Because they assume the problem is your nature instead of the environments that failed to understand it. The truth is harder to face. Not everyone knows how to meet emotional depth. Some people are comfortable with surface connection, predictable interaction, safe conversation, relationships that require little vulnerability, but your inner world does not survive there for long. You crave something more difficult: honesty, presence, emotion, truth. And when that truth is absent, something inside you pulls away, not from cruelty, from self-preservation. Because betrayal does not only happen in relationships. Sometimes betrayal happens inside yourself. Every time you silence your intuition to avoid conflict, every time you ignore discomfort to keep peace, every time you accept emotional crumbs while pretending you feel fulfilled, and your soul remembers. That is why you became more selective, not colder, wiser. You stopped forcing closeness where trust did not exist. Stopped chasing validation that required self-abandonment. Stop shrinking your inner world just to remain acceptable. And some people misunderstood that change. They called it distance. But perhaps they never realized something important. You were not becoming harder to love. You were becoming harder to manipulate. Because the rarest personalities do not reject connection. They reject falseness. They may walk away, remain quiet, protect their energy. Not because they lack heart, but because somewhere along the way, they made a silent promise. Never betray your inner world again. This is not about feeling special. It is about facing something deeper. Because having a rare personality is not a gift wrapped in comfort. It is a burden of awareness, and awareness changes everything. And once you truly begin to see through awareness, there is no returning to ignorance. You start noticing things that cannot be unseen. Emotional patterns in people before they speak. Hidden tension behind polite smiles. Unspoken truths living between words. Shifts in energy that others comfortably ignore. At first, you think everyone sees it. You assume this level of perception is normal. But slowly, you realize something unsettling. They don't. Most people are not processing life at the depth you are. They move through situations without analyzing the emotional undercurrent. They let moments pass without absorbing their weight. They forget quickly, detach easily, recover faster. And you don't. You carry. Not because you want to, but because your awareness does not switch off when things become uncomfortable. And that is where the burden begins. Because awareness removes illusion. It strips away emotional comfort that ignorance once provided. You can no longer pretend words always mean what they sound like. You can no longer ignore emotional inconsistency. You can no longer participate in connections that feel shallow without feeling internal resistance. And this creates a quiet isolation, not always physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. You are present in the world, but not always aligned with it. You feel too much, too clearly, too deeply. And while others move on quickly, you remain behind in reflection, replaying moments, analyzing intentions, feeling energies that were never acknowledged out loud. And slowly, you begin to understand something difficult. Awareness does not only reveal truth, it also increases sensitivity to truth, which means pain is not just experienced, it is absorbed. But here is what most people never realize. This burden is also a form of clarity. You are not easily manipulated. You are not easily deceived. You are not easily distracted from what is real. And that comes at a cost, because clarity removes comfort, but it also removes illusion. And in a world built on emotional noise, distraction, and surface-level connection, seeing clearly can feel like loneliness. Not because you are broken, but because your perception is awake in environments that often prefer emotional sleep. So you learn to move carefully, to choose depth over volume, truth over performance, presence over pretense. And even though awareness can feel heavy, it also becomes something else over time, a responsibility, a reminder that once you see life clearly, you can never go back to pretending you don't. If you have always felt different, emotionally, lie intense, hard to explain, then stay with this until the end, because you may finally understand why your life never fit inside ordinary expectations. There has always been a quiet mismatch in you, not obvious at first, but constant. You were in places where others seemed relaxed, while your mind was already overanalyzing everything beneath the surface. You were in conversations where people laughed easily, while you were reading between emotional lines no one else noticed. And you started wondering if something inside you was misplaced. Why does everything feel deeper for me? Why do I get overwhelmed by things others ignore? Why do I feel too much, too often, too intensely? So you tried to adjust. You tried to become lighter, less reactive, less aware, less affected. but it never fully worked, because your system was not designed for emotional simplicity. It was designed for depth. And depth does not turn off just because the world prefers ease. This is where the M is understanding begins. People often assume intensity is instability, but sometimes intensity is precision. Your emotional world is not random. It is responsive. It picks up signals others miss. Tone changes, energy shifts, unspoken tension, hidden discomfort behind calm faces. And while others move forward without noticing, you pause. You feel it. You process it. And you carry it longer than expected. This creates a life experience that feels slightly out of sync with the majority. You may connect deeply, but rarely casually. You may trust slowly, but feel everything strongly once trust is formed. You may love sincerely, but struggle with superficial bonds that feel emotionally empty. And over time, you start feeling like you don't fit the pace of the world around you. Not because you are behind, but because you are operating differently. Your inner world processes meaning where others process moments. Your nervous system remembers what others release. Your mind questions what others accept without thought. And your soul refuses to ignore emotional truth just to maintain comfort. This is why ordinary expectations never fully held you. They were built around predictability, but you are built around perception. And perception is not always comfortable. It sees too much, feels too deeply, questions too honestly. But here is what slowly becomes clear as you begin to understand yourself. You were never meant to fit inside every environment. You were meant to recognize which environments could hold your depth and which ones could not. And that realization changes everything. Because once you stop forcing yourself into spaces that cannot hold you, you finally begin to understand the shape of your own nature. And now you see it clearly. You were never broken for feeling deeply. You were never wrong for noticing what others ignore. You were never too intense for this world. You were simply awake in places that reward sleep. Stop shrinky. NG to be understood. Stop silencing yourself to be accepted. Stop abandoning your inner truth just to belong. Not every environment deserves your depth. Not every person deserves your energy. Your awareness is not a burden anymore, it is direction. From now on, choose what honors your sensitivity, not what exhausts it. Because the moment you stop betraying yourself, your entire life begins to realign.